Sunday, January 7th, 1906. Here I sit alone on Chinsegut Hill. Last night, after we had all gone to sleep, very tired, we were waked from dreams by a sound of fiddles, guitars, etc., and a dozen or so men singing out in front of the south veranda. Through bewilderment comes presently the realization we are being serenaded. Margaret and I exchange a whispered word through our communicating door and hurriedly dress, I throwing on a coat and skirt over a nightgown simply. Out in the moonlight on the porch, Margaret and I find a group of laughing, merry people, among whom I recognize only Margaret Fulton and Mr. Bracey, our bidgemaster. Margaret Robbins, laughing, pelts them with oranges, which is taken with great merriment and goodwill. We take them into the sitting room and revive the great fire. Raymond comes and welcomes them. They all sit round on the shaky old rosewood chairs and the stout new rush broom rockers, and 3 men, more daring than they know, sit on the hussy card table between fire and door. This is the broken one, and has its legs only propped under it. But it stands staunchly through all that follows, with its unusual cargo of 3 men and 3 musical instruments. We have no light but the blazing pine, yet we sit in a brilliantly illuminated room. After a good deal of rather incoherent talk and laughter, we get them to tune up again. The bidgemaster is a bandmaster, and he and his men, not carpenters, but cashiers, clerks, and other townsmen, it appears are accustomed to playing together. They have called themselves long before our advent here, the Snow Hill Band. Well, they play 3 or 4 things which we punctuate with vigorous applause. Raymond takes up his place just behind me, leaning on a piece of the old mahogany sideboard. How amazed my grandmother would have been to see her ancient belongings in such surroundings. After a while, we ask the company to sing again. They do so for the next half hour. Raymond with "Play Old Kentucky Home." Most of the people of substance hereabouts hail from that state, and a greater proportion still of the old orange growers were Kentuckians, I gather. But when frost and disillusionment fell upon them, many left, as the Mackays did. After the serenaders have sung other things, I ask for Dixie, and they give us that and the Suwannee River. Then the bidgemaster, after saying tentatively, "I guess you all don't care about comic songs," and over-expressing a passionate fondness for the same, obliges with a ditty whose hilarious intent I must take on trust, as the company all joined in and I couldn't distinguish the words. I whisper to Raymond, "What a pity there's nothing to give them here in the way of good cheer. What are they accustomed to on these occasions?" "Oh, hot drinks and supper," says Raymond. And then the singing wound up with "Home Sweet Home," after I've flown to the kitchen for a half a dozen packages of lemon cakes, which we tear open and empty into old blue crockery soup tureen, which is by now emptied of oranges. Raymond goes out and brings in a bottle of Apollinaris and Poland water from Maine, saying, laughing as he comes through the throng, "This is a false alarm, friends." It was noticeable after Raymond's speech of welcome, from his point of vantage behind me, commanding the room, leaning on the piece of sideboard. He referred to this house as an unfinished wigwam and its deficiencies, addressing them as braves and squaws gathered again in these different days round the great council fire on the hill. He declared peace and friendship, etc., etc. They applauded his speech, but no one was so carried away as to want to drink water. We passed the lemon cakes and the oranges, and the best of our poor ability manifest our goodwill. Then we made at last a light other than the fire blaze for the company to sign their names in our visitors' book. Mrs. Bracey, the chaperone of the party, signed first, and called up Mr. Young's girls one by one to set their names in the Chinsegut book that I had bought in Brook Street on Grosvenor Square in London. As each one, with some laughing and embarrassment, comes up, once again called she is the target of the friendly banter of the rest. It has been developed before that there is one young man who did not play any musical instrument, who, whether to make good this discrepancy or from natural bent alone, has appointed himself the wag of the party. His addressing one of the girls, I think it was Miss Hattie Rice, as Rosebud was hailed with peals of laughter. He is the last to sign, and I perceive only then that he is probably the young Mr. Law, son of the cashier and some official of some kind of the Brooksville band, and himself a cashier. During the playing, I have tried to get the faces in my mind. I noticed as they played beside Mr. Bracey, a ruggeder-faced youth, dark and with a certain muddy likeness to Arnold Foster. And he played the guitar with supple fingers. He was a Sewell, I think. Then there was young Nevitt. Oh, I believe he didn't play either, but I imagine he sang. And another Sewell. It was either he or the Bidgemaster's brother, Harry Bracey, who played a mandolin, and one played a fiddle and one a cello. The last one was a good-looking youth, probably Burritt. Mrs. Bracey, wife of the Bidgemaster, to my astonishment whispered to me during one phase of tuning up that she'd heard I'd been on the stage. Was it true? Beside her sat Miss Martin, a great gawky, nervous young woman who fancied herself enormously, tossing her head with a high roll of flaxen hair and laughing hysterically. She it was who at the close of the proceedings came up and said, "What an honor," etc., and referred to her desire to read some of my pieces. So echoes penetrate even in this wilderness. One girl of quieter ways was quite pretty, Mamie S. Hutton. After staying with us indoors about an hour, they depart, 4 of them returning the 5 miles or so to their home in buggies, and 11 of them riding. Good night, goodbye, and away they go in the moonlight. Welcome to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kaler. In today's episode, we'll talk about music in Elizabeth's lifetime. As an actress in Gilded Age New York, Elizabeth would have seen extraordinary musicians performing. But what was the musical life of the rest of the country? Today, we're going to talk to Emily Eubanks, a doctoral student at Florida State University. Emily is currently writing an article on women's musical culture in Florida, based on a manuscript sheet music book from Jacksonville that is housed at FSU. Emily, hello, welcome, and why don't you just introduce yourself and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, hi, Natalie. First off, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I think it's a really interesting project, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. So I'm a PhD candidate in musicology at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And as you mentioned, my research covers material culture on women's musical practices in the home. And I've done projects on music salon and parlor culture, as well as music management and music agents in the US in the 20s and 30s.
That is such a specific and interesting thing. So what caused you to go that route? Are you just a big music lover? Is it the period that interested you? How did you land in this space?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, actually. So I grew up playing the silver flute, and a lot of the repertoire that I was given and taught and spent time learning was written in the last 2 centuries. So I think engaging with that repertoire really made me curious about the musical context and the historical context of those pieces. And I also think my interest in women's lives and experiences was largely informed by my upbringing, because I was often surrounded by strong communities of women in my family and in school and in my music studies. So I think those communities really shaped an appreciation and interest in women's experiences.
So, Emily, can you walk us through the kinds of music that were being played and sung in the time period that you're covering and we're talking about today?
Sure. So if we're thinking about the musical performances that Robbins describes in this diary excerpt, she mentions that instrumentalists are playing plucked strings like guitars and mandolins, and bowed string instruments like the violin and cello, largely to accompany songs. So this is very common. The Snow Hill Band that she describes seems to have been a group of amateur musicians that were all men, and were from the nearby community. So this was very common at the time. And I think it would be interesting to dive into this and see if they were a traveling group that went to other towns as well, or if they were just used within their community. I don't know if you've come across any of that evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they were basically going around throughout the city, but that would be interesting to find documentation for that. We don't have as much written information on the snow period. They were busy farming and working the land, and so a lot of what we get is going to be from other people that were living around them at the time. But that would be fun to know for sure. Anybody has any insight on that? Contact us. Let us know.
I also think it's interesting that she mentions that they were requesting specific songs to be sung in the moment. So that seems to suggest that most of these amateur musicians in the group were learning and playing these songs by ear, which of course was very common for a lot of genres and repertoires of the time.
But it also requires more skill that way, wouldn't it? I mean,
Yeah, I would say different skill for sure. And this is a reflection of learning approaches of the time, because some pedagogues advocated for teaching by ear first and then training people in how to read notated music. And other schools of thought it was better to first use the notated music and then apply singing and oral skills. So music education, of course, wasn't standardized by this point in time.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe stylistically the kinds of music that we're talking about?
So I think we're really fortunate that Robbins identifies the titles, the names of the songs that were sung at this domestic gathering. So that gives us a lot of information to go off of. One of them was Home Sweet Home. So this is a piece that came from a really popular opera in the early 19th century. And it was so well loved that they rearranged and released the song Home Sweet Home as a parlor ballad. So this is very common, to take operatic pieces or arias that people seemed to really like and publish them for at-home performance.
Can you explain what you mean by parlor piece?
Parlor music was often marketed to women of the elite class, of the middle classes, to be performed at home in the parlor. And they often weren't extremely technical pieces, so they were quite accessible for a wide range of players. And parlor music was intended to allow women to display themselves as well-rounded, refined, educated women who had achieved some level of music proficiency. Right. And this would be a good reflection on not only them, but their families as families that were able to afford a well-rounded education for their daughters. And so this kind of gets into the ideal of gentility, right? A refined etiquette or polite conduct that women were encouraged to display in the parlor. Now
that makes a lot of sense. And so would the music difficulty be different? Like when they changed Home Sweet Home and made it accessible for parlor music, would it have been written differently and in a less complicated way for the parlor?
Yeah, I think in most cases it would have, because you're taking a piece that would have initially required a full or good-sized orchestra and vocalist, and you're reducing it for a single keyboard player in most cases and a singer, or maybe just the keyboard. So there is quite a bit of reduction that has to take place in order to make it playable by one or just a few musicians.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the composers that people might recognize from that time period, or that we need to know about?
This is a hard question because there were just so many people writing music at this time. So people might recognize John Philip Sousa. He produced a lot of military marches that were pretty popular during this period. We also have Scott Joplin, who's credited with popularizing ragtime music at the turn of the century. Stephen Foster is best known for popular songs. And if we look at the art music world of instrumental and vocal art music, Florence Price was a really influential, important composer as well.
Okay, so that's a woman. That was going to be my next question. Were women writing and and publishing music at this point?
Women were pursuing careers as music composers and performers. Across the board, the wealthier women were largely discouraged from pursuing professional musical careers, but we do know they were receiving a pretty thorough musical training. So they had a certain degree or certain level of music proficiency that I think a lot of them had the skill to write music if they had decided to do so. When it comes to publication opportunities, we do have many examples of women who launched careers as composers. One person that comes to mind that has a lot of overlap with Robbins is Dame Ethel Smith. She was a British woman from the upper middle class in Britain, and she attended conservatory in Leipzig and was established in really well-known music circles that helped her get her music published and performed by major orchestras in Germany and even London. And in the 19-teens, she was connected with the women's movement and met Emmeline Pankhurst and started actually writing music specifically for the women's movement.
Yeah, we actually have, when you mentioned her, I have her in Elizabeth's diary. So there definitely was a lot of interaction between the two of them. So they would have been buddies. Elizabeth spent a lot of her time in London. So they would have been in the same circles and doing the same suffrage stuff. That's really cool.
And she could have heard this music too that Smith was composing. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about accessibility to sheet music. So it's one thing just to have a song passed along, generation to generation, but how are people in a rural place like Brooksville in Florida, which is not very well developed at this point, getting this sheet music in the first place?
So around this time in the late 19th century, especially, sheet music is becoming more accessible to people across the U.S. It's largely due to two advances. So we see technological advances in music printing, which makes it faster and a bit cheaper to produce. Okay. And then that's combined with the railway expansion that's also occurring at this time. So it is true that more people could access and purchase sheet music. It was often sold in general stores. But as you said, it's definitely going to be dependent on people's access to roads and larger towns.
So while we're still talking about access, how would they have gotten instruments, and what instruments are they going to be most likely to play in this time period?
So large established musical instrument manufacturers and distributors are also being established around the late 19th, early 20th century. So we see companies like London and Healy or the Haynes Company producing and disseminating catalogs across the country. So people could peruse the catalogs and see what sort of musical instruments, sheet music, and other basic music supplies they could purchase. Sometimes these were imported from Europe, and other times they were manufactured and built in the US. And this is also coinciding with the founding of US colleges and universities. So more people are getting long-term serious access to musical training. And if we're thinking about who is purchasing these musical instruments, women were largely the catered market for the sale of pianos. So in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, we see an exponential increase in the number of pianos that are being sold. Women were also encouraged to play harp and guitar and even banjo. So overall, they were largely encouraged to play instruments that wouldn't require them to make what was perceived as an unflattering physical stance, whether that be a physical posture or facial expression, or even anything that could be seen as sexually suggestive.
So they weren't going to be doing cellos or playing horns or something that kind of made disfigured their ability to sit dignified.
In theory, yes, that's what was encouraged. Yeah. But of course, we have notable path breakers around this period that are breaking the mold. So women's orchestras, military bands, and like bugle clubs are also being formed, and they're quite successful too at the beginning of the 20th century.
So If you're playing an instrument, you said, we touched on this a little bit earlier, that sometimes they were learning how to do sheet music first. Sometimes they were learning to play by ear. If you didn't play an instrument, how common was it that people were able to read sheet music in general?
By the early 20th century, it was very common, especially in the classes. I think, as we touched on before, it was expected for a well-rounded education. One would be expected to know how to read music in most cases. So this would either be acquired in school, or maybe your family hires a private tutor, or you could study with an older family member. But we also see many people from the middle classes receiving music education in schools as well. Especially as the 20th century progresses, music education becomes increasingly more established in general curricula. And of course, access to the training in how to read notated music was largely unequal across class and racial divides, right? But there are cases where people of color in the South were studying notated music and how to read music right alongside others.
Well, and I think too, like, I know myself, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, but I learned to read music through the hymnal, just going to church. You kind of get used to after a while, just seeing all that. And so that was my earliest way that I started to understand how all that worked.
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's been happening since for centuries. Yeah. Yep.
We'll have to get you down to Chinsegut at some point. We do have a very large box of the sheet music that was in the house at that time. Elizabeth's sister-in-law, Margaret, had grown up in Brooklyn, and they would meet at the piano every night at 5 o'clock, and everybody had different instruments that they played, and they would sing every single night at 5. And so she ends up creating a music room in Chinsegut on the east side of the house. But we have all of her sheet music, which I think is so fascinating. Some of it that she transcribed herself, or do you call it transcribing? I don't know, when you're writing your own music from a sheet.
Yeah, and that was actually very common. Another way that women could access music that maybe they couldn't purchase the actual printed sheet music for is to just hand copy it into a manuscript document. Yeah.
Let's talk about the role of music in the home life.
Yeah, so music took on many roles when it came to the home. Of course, people could create music in their homes with the intention of it being very private, right? For just personal enjoyment, passing of time, or refinement, like learning and improving your musical skills. Or if we're thinking also about shape note singing, it was used for religious purposes in the home. And then if we're thinking of performance in the home for guests beyond the home, so the parlor, for example, is this a designated room in the home that's intended to receive guests? So music in this room could include singing, dancing, and listening to recognizable medleys and arrangements, again, of maybe operatic pieces or just popular tunes or patriotic tunes. And as the 20th century progresses, we see women performing not only these more simple, recognizable tunes, but also more challenging repertoire like Beethoven sonatas, pieces by Chopin, Mendelssohn, and Schumann. So again, this is a place where music is used to display a woman's refinement and her family's economic and social standing as a way of performing gentility, right? That ideal etiquette and conduct.
Let's talk about the songs that are specifically mentioned in today's diary entry and see what you can tell us about those.
Sure. So Robbins mentions 3 specific songs, Dixie, Swanee River, and Old Kentucky Home, as being performed at this gathering. And it's interesting that all 3 of these tunes came out of the tradition of blackface minstrelsy from the mid to late 19th century. And I do think it's important, before we dig into this conversation, that we give listeners a sort of content warning, because a lot of the the text and the performance itself is quite problematic and racist. So blackface minstrelsy was a theatrical genre that featured exaggerated and overtly dehumanizing depictions of African American musicians. So this was often done by using exaggerated Southern Black dialect and painting the performer's faces black with a burnt cork, and relying on what's been described as buffoon-like personas or stock characters. And a lot of these times, these songs will idealize life on the plantation and the institution of slavery in general. So they create what's been described as this happy slave narrative. So attempting to suggest that slavery as an institution is beneficial for all.
Were they written when slavery was still legal, or were these post-Civil War things to try to help that narrative a little?
Well, they operated on, I think, both fronts. The 3 songs that were performed in Robin's home were all written in the 1850s and were composed by composers who were either performers or composers intending for them to be performed on the blackface minstrelsy stage. We see, I think this is evidence that they have a long history, right? Well into today, because 2 of these tunes were adopted as state songs. Swanee River became the Florida state song in 1935, and Old Kentucky Home would become the state song of Kentucky in 1928.
That's interesting. Well, and that is where Elizabeth and Raymond were both from. So their ancestors were in Kentucky. And so I'm sure that's why he specifically requested that one for sure.
Yeah. And some of these tunes were retexted. Dixie, for example, we know there were various versions of the song. It was originally titled, "I Wish I Was in Dixie's Land." But by the American Civil War, we see versions of the song there. The text is altered to create pro-Union sentiment as well as pro-Confederacy. So unfortunately, Robbins doesn't identify which version was sung, and maybe we can consider her own political standings or the political sentiments of the Snow Hill Band to kind of speculate what version was sung, but we'll probably never know.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So this was kind of a celebration. It was a welcome to our community party that they were having for them. What role was music playing overall in celebrations at this point?
In the 19th and 20th centuries, as music had for centuries, it was central when it came to community celebrations. So we would expect military bands, community bands like the Snow Hill Band, and even orchestras and choirs in larger cities to play a central role in celebrations. And they could provide music for dancing or for patriotic songs, or just to, amp up the crowd essentially and provide an energy of celebration. But I think overall, when it comes to music and celebrations, music plays a really important role in building or reinforcing community and a sense of shared identity with those who are collectively participating in the celebration.
So not too different than what we have today. Music's pretty consistent. If you were going to share with us what the biggest misconception is that you think that people would have about music at this time, what would you say?
I think when it comes to music in the home specifically, people often, or there's often a perception that this repertoire was neutral and simply used for lighthearted entertainment or enjoyment purposes. But I think it's important for us to remember that the music that's performed in these spaces can tell us a lot about the historical and cultural contexts in which it was being performed. So music in the home could be very political, and it could also be very technically challenging repertoire, very demanding repertoire. And for women especially, the performance of music in the home could be used as a sort of cultural capital, right, to negotiate or affirm their class status or their cultural status.
We're talking about political. One of the other pieces of sheet music that we have at the house are Hull House songs. And so it's a collection of songs that they were supposed to sing when they were in marches, either for labor issues or suffrage issues. And it was printed up specifically by Jane Addams for people to take with them on the streets when they were doing their political stuff, which is super fascinating.
That is cool. And it's interesting to think that it made it all the way to Florida, right? And whether or not they continue to sing those songs outside the Hull House context.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it would talk about, there was one that talks about being in a mine, as a child, and the perspective of a child from there. So yeah, there's definitely, again, as of today, there are people that put the politics into music and try to communicate their message that way. And the Robins were very involved in the labor movement, so it's not a shock to find those things in there, but always interesting. I guess, would you say then that it's the same as looking at somebody's bookshelves? When you look at their sheet music, you can kind of figure out a little bit who they are?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Again, if we're thinking about the parlor, it's a site where women and families could display an identity, right? And the sheet music they collected and rested on the piano, or the books, as you mentioned, that they put on display on their shelves, or the artwork they hung in the room. So yeah, I think material culture in many ways can tell us a lot about a person and how they want to be perceived, or maybe how they don't want to be perceived.
That's a great point. If somebody wanted to read more about this, is there a specific resource that you would recommend, since your thesis isn't done yet?
Right. There's been a lot of really fantastic work on music in the U.S. South during this period. If I had to pick one, I think I would recommend people take a look at Candace Bailey's work. She's published widely on women's musical practices in the South and has done a lot of in-depth study of surviving sheet music and parlor culture in general. So she recently released a book in 2021 called Unbinding Gentility: Women Making Music in the 19th Century South. And I would definitely recommend anyone take a look at it who's interested in these topics.
Thank you so much, Emily. You have been a trooper. Emily did this while we didn't have power for 30 minutes, and we managed to get through this. And you were just amazing and stayed on point the whole time, and I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you so much. It's been real fun to talk about this, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about robins and to discuss these topics with you.
Chinsegut Hill continued to be a very musical place. When the Snow family owned the property, they added porches all around the house on the first and second floor. They screened in the east side to use for an eating and sleeping area. In the 1920s, Raymond's wife Margaret would convert the east porch into a music room to house her baby grand. But that is a story for another podcast. On the next episode of the Elizabeth Robins Diary podcast, we will read more of Elizabeth's visit to Brooksville and meet someone whose great-grandpap is talked about in her diary. Thank you for listening to the Elizabeth Robins Diary podcast, a creation and production of Brooksville Main Street, a nonprofit focused on economic redevelopment through historic preservation and placemaking. The podcast is made possible with the help of a generous grant from Florida Humanities and the brilliant minds of our guest expert, like Emily Eubanks. Would you please consider following and rating the podcast? By following us, you'll be sure not to miss an episode. And rating is a super helpful way to help us spread the word and support all the hard work of the following people. Leif Thomason of Odd Life Studios produced this content, as well as editing, mixing, and mastering it. Tom and Patria Dye opened Profound Revelation Studios in downtown Brooksville, allowing us to create this content right in the heart of our city. The docents of Chinsegut Hill Historic Site and Andrea Reed generously provided research support and advice. Fales Library of New York University for access to Elizabeth's collection, and University of Florida, who houses the Chinsegut guest books in the Margaret Dreyer Robins collection. Thanks to the guest book, we can look at everyone who came that night as part of the Snow Hill Band. Much thanks to Independent Age, a charity who owns the intellectual rights to Elizabeth's Fales material, and they kindly granted us permission to cite them. Find out more about them at independentage.org. Barry Mindel of DeBar Design created our lovely graphics. Elisa Babor of Roots Creative Co. designed an amazing website and social media. Randy Olson of Live Oak Theater wrote and performed our theme song, Time is Whispering. Special thanks to Florida Humanities for assisting with podcast funding. And of course, Elizabeth Robbins, who did such amazing work writing about her life in a way that allows us to feel we are there with her. I can stand in the parlor that still holds some of Elizabeth's chairs and imagine it stuffed full of the Snow Hill Band and the sounds of laughter and fiddle playing emanating from it. It's an honor for me to executive produce, write, and host this telling of her story.